so that even if you miss it, you can still come back. So the title of this week is The Challenge of Talking to White People About Racism. And the challenge is just, even in the title, you look at that title and you go, but I don't want to talk more about racism. I've been told not to talk about racism. I don't like talking, when we get into talking about racism, you know, and we get all those things that just naturally bubble up, don't we? Built into our system, built into who we have been taught to be. And part of what we have to do is try to figure out how to overcome that. She talked about racial stamina, and I love this quote that she used, where she said, to increase the racial stamina that counters white fragility, we must reflect on the whole of our identities and our racial identity in particular. And the hard part about that is we've been taught not to do that. We've been taught often and well not to do that. And so we have to go against much of what we've learned in the past in order to do that. We have to move into a better relationship to racism than that. So tell me, how are you struggling this week? Where are you at right now in the struggle with racism?
Mm-hmm. Jim, could I bring up something we were talking about last week, education?
Yes.
Because I think we all think it's really important, you know, and we're pretty focused, this group here, you know, to educate some of those subconscious things that pop up.
That's right.
And so we're really kind of motivated, but what I worry about, and I wonder what your thoughts are just people in general, you know, because unless you really work at it, you're not going to dissipate those subconscious reactions to things. You got to want to. You got to want to.
That's right.
So we can lead, you know, lead the horse to water, but getting it to drink is a different story.
Yeah. Well,
so,
but,
you know,
but much of that is because we have told each other for way too long what we shouldn't do. And those things that we shouldn't do aren't necessarily right. And I hope you read in chapter 1 that she is saying very clearly some of the things that we've been taught around racial issues only perpetuate the racism and the ability to step into those roles rather than changing anything. And so you're right that we have to be willing to go into spaces and say, but very boldly, let's think differently about this.
and I'm concerned that they're not that's not the prevailing issue right now in general.
Well, I don't know that it's not the prevailing one, but there's a whole bunch of opposite voice, Art. And you have to say, no, that's not helpful. Opposite voice. There's a whole bunch of people that are saying the old party line that says you have to act like you're not a racist.
Yeah.
Okay. Leticia.
I just wanted to let Art know, because I don't think he was in the first class. I work a lot on the Latino side, right? And also with my Black brothers and sisters that are trying to find a balanced place to where we are empowered to say, you know, Art, that was kind of off-colored, and I'm not going to respond to racism.
Right.
I'm not going to say that was racist. It may have been bigoted, it may have been off-colored, it may have been insensitive. We're trying to change the language on our side too, because it's now to the point where it's a action-reaction thing. And it's hard for people of privilege to realize that maybe some of the things that they're saying is off-colored or offensive. It's not meant to be.
Yeah, no,
the communication needs to go both ways.
I agree, and I agree entirely with what you're saying. My concern is that a lot of people just aren't willing to put the effort in to do it. It's easy not to do it. You know, it's easy to continue going on. And
The
so
good
I don't
news
know
is,
how we-
the good news is, Art, I think there's more people that are willing to do it now
Yeah,
than ever.
yeah,
What we have to do is we have to change some of the conversation of what's happening. So I want to go back to just basic definitions so that we're on the same place with some of these basic definitions. So that, because sometimes I think we're fighting the wrong battles and people are fighting against the wrong things. So let me just put a couple things up here. This is more me than what it is her, just so you know. So bias versus prejudice. First of all, I want to look at that. Bias, we all have bias. I don't think that bias by itself has, I don't think it's positive or negative. It is just what it is. We have some kind of inclination one direction or another. Okay? Do you like vanilla or do you like chocolate more? That type of thing. But it can result in unfairness. Prejudice is basically when you have something like a bias, but it's not based on any experience, any reason, and it's often connected to the social group of the other individual. I like or don't like this person because they're part of this group. I draw some conclusion about them because they're part of that group. And it usually, whereas in the other, it can result in unfairness, prejudice usually results in discrimination. Okay, so if I take the vanilla or chocolate one, this is more saying vanilla is the only good flavor, right? And so it's making a judgment there. That makes sense? Both of those are relatively innocuous compared to the next two, though. Discrimination is an action based on prejudice, which might include but is not limited to, and you can see all the things it might be. It's where we act out on our prejudice. Discrimination is an action term where prejudice is more of a head term. Okay? This is part of where we have to work. But I want to take it one step further because this is where we really want to have the discussion, not on bias or prejudice, because we all have them. And we need to talk about that just because we need to stop leaving the conversation at this level. We've been told not even to mention our bias, our prejudices, and so we don't get to the deeper levels. So discrimination is where we act on it, and racism is when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, creating a system that functions above any of the individual actors. This is where we really want to have the discussion. This is not a question of, is Mary prejudiced? Because the answer to that question is, yes, she is. Does Peggy have bias? Because the answer to that is, yes, she does. This is, in the midst of all that, what is driving it so that we have a system that helps us more easily live in those biases and not question those biases and easily have discrimination. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's where we want to have the discussion, is in that area of racism. And that is not a you're bad. That is, their system there is making it easier for us or harder for us, depending on which part of the population we are. And we are way too often, at one point she said, we are taught to have a racial viewpoint. We are taught that to have a racial viewpoint is to be biased. Unfortunately, this belief protects our biases. If we do not acknowledge our biases, if we do not acknowledge our racism, it gets deeper because it gets hidden. How many have seen that in practice somewhere? Mm-hmm. And the problem is, Art, is when you try to have the conversations you're having, some of the people that you're going to try to have those conversations with are going to say, I'm not supposed to have those kinds of conversations. I'm not supposed to talk about racism. And they won't say it like that, but that's essentially what their reaction is. And we've got to find ways to get around that.
One of the things that I notice from people of color, and some of you have heard this, It's people of color will tell you, I can't be racist, I can't be prejudiced because I'm a person of color. And that's just a downright lie.
That's not true.
Now, I will say, Leticia, having said that, as you go to chapter 2, you'll see that she does make a distinction. She will say that people of color can't be prejudiced. Excuse me, can't be racist. I struggle with that some, but she will say that they can be prejudiced, but not racist, because racism is an institutional thing, not an individual thing. Does that make sense?
I'll agree with that. But that's part of this group of people that I'm working with that is trying to take the whole racism word out of all the conversation, because we're just not treating people with basic dignity and respect.
Yeah, but that's because we have been told for a long time to not acknowledge racism, because we're supposed to be past that. We passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and since then we haven't had any problems. Okay, so and partially that's because we have made great strides since then. We've done some wonderful things since then, but it's also made it much easier for us to acknowledge to ignore what has not changed and to just accept it, especially when it benefits us.
Well, I think,
Jim,
that's
go ahead.
Go ahead, Harvey.
I think that's the essence of racism. Racism is prejudice plus power.
That's exactly right.
And one of the things that she says on my book, it's on page 21, and she talks about the male dominance.
I'm sorry, say that again. You got.
In my edition, it's on page 21. The male dominance.
The male dominance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a matter of just simply prejudice plus power. It's the dominance of the male structure and the male image and the male way of thinking that pervades our understanding.
It's white male thinking. It's not just male, because women wouldn't have the vote, Native Americans, colored, anybody, unless white men had granted it to us.
Yeah,
it was
right.
us, the suffrage movement, begging for acceptance and the right to vote. So white male privilege really transcends all of it. And that's a toughie.
It is tough because it means that it is larger than any of us by ourselves. It doesn't mean it can't be changed, but it may mean you have to tear the whole thing down in a way, right? And figure out what different has to happen. And anytime we've tried to do that, there's been a lot of backlash to that, right?
Jim and I had a conversation about a week ago, and there's a cultural divide, especially when you're dealing with whites and Hispanics, right, Jim?
Mm-hmm.
Because the culture is not male dominated. As much as people think it's a muy machismo culture, it is very matriarchal, and the women carry a lot of power within that culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very helped by, in the book that we have on page 21, where she writes, racism is a system. And I live within a series of systems.
Yes.
I live in a healthcare system, an education system, and a race system, and I have all my life. And at some time earlier in my life, in order to be accepted, I had to join a system of one way or another, whether it was political or racist or about women. And I got an attitude or an ideology about it. And I think that that's what really helped me grasp what I think she's trying to say here is the system that I belong to is the way I'm going to behave. And that's where my biases will show up
Yeah.
and my prejudice.
Yes.
When I lived in Rockford, we had an education system there was very discriminating. And, but I belonged to a country club. Boy, you talk about bias, and I had to have a system there. So I live in systems, and racism is only systematic, only one of them.
Yes.
That really helped me a lot. So
Yeah.
I wanted to bring that up to see how other people felt about that.
Well, I think it's essential, Mike, that all of us, as we're trying to have these conversations with the people around us, don't get caught up in the loop where we're essentially saying, are you racist? Am I racist? Right? We have to get into the larger conversation than that. Now, the hard part is that it means that we have to be able to just acknowledge we just are. We all carry things from our past. We all have conceptions in our mind about how the world works, some of them along the racial lines. And we have to just acknowledge that those are just present and that we can all work on them, but that's not even the question. The question is larger. Where have those been set up with political power in some way, with money power, with all kinds of different strengthening elements that allow it to benefit one group over another group?
I shared with Jim, I took an art history class last session. And we had to talk about iconoclasm. Am I saying that right?
Iconoclasm.
I started investigating urban renewal. You guys remember what happened during urban renewal, right? Everybody left city centers and then pointed to downtown centers and said, blight, it's slums, it's whatever, and disregarded that they were communities. And by tearing them all down, they tore down those minority and poor people's opportunity to enter into the free market system as entrepreneurs. They took away affordable business areas, affordable housing.
Yeah.
So there's many ways, especially economically, that current generations don't have the language for, but they sure do feel the effects, right? And it's the generations now.
Right.
So she talked about two different things that I think get in the way here. She talked about objectivity and individualism. Okay,
Yeah.
and how those are not helpful. Objectivity basically says it is possible to be free of all bias. And the correct term, the correct answer to that is very similar to the word bias, but without the I and the A. It's just not possible. We have to stop telling that story. We have to help each other to stop telling that story. Objectivity just is, as much as we'd like to do that, as much as we strive towards doing that, we all carry our past into this present situation. And it affects how we view this. And we carry not just our past, we carry the past of whatever groups we belong to. Right? And all of that affects how we view this present moment. The second thing is individualism. One of the great stories in America is that we are free, right? But oftentimes that means I am, not we are. And I can do anything I want to. I'm unique, I'm individual, and nobody's like me. And while that's true, it also doesn't tell the story about how we can see some of what's true about us. Joni, you're the only one that can really answer this question. So unmute yourself and get ready to answer. Are there truths about the Wilt Bank family that carry beyond the individuals of any particular Wilt Bank?
Yes.
She's had to face the fact
Hard
that,
answer.
yeah, she's had to face the fact that there are things about my family that are just true, whether I like them or not, whether I celebrate them or whatever. There's truth about my family, good and bad truths, right?
Well as mine.
What?
As well as mine.
Yes, and that's true about all of our families. And when we try to say I am, and we're trying to focus just on the individual, then we miss the stories about what we can tell. Okay? The different things that happen around us, whether it's class, race, heritage, all of those things tell a story where we can draw some generalizations about us. That doesn't mean that on the individual level that I shouldn't be trying to deal with the person in front of me. I shouldn't be looking at them to just say all Wilt Banks are this way, right? I should see who this Wilt Bank is. And we should do that, but that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about how can we, in the midst of all that, have those general stories that say, here's some truths about groups of us. For example, how many know, even though every woman and every man acts differently, that there are some basic truths that you can say, generalizations about the different genders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? There are things that are true that help us to understand each other. Now, having said that, we have to then say that's not going to fit perfectly in all cases. We do overgeneralization on a regular basis, but there are things that we can tell. There are things, men are dominated by different storylines than what women are as a general rule. That's what we have to, that's what we have to be, that's where we have to be in the midst of all this, is doing that. So she talked about how, go ahead.
This is a question of socialization beginning early in life in the family unit, where boys are socialized to be more physical. Boys are given a hammer and girls are given a doll, for example. That kind of socialization that begins very early.
Sure, but it's two different things though, Mary. There are things that are socialized and there are other things which are true. Outside, my skin is basically the same color it was when I was born. There are other pieces of me that are basically the same as when I was born. There are other things I'm socialized into. So we have both inherited stuff and we have that which is socialized. Both of them are true. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, true.
And we just have to acknowledge that that's there and figure out what to do with the fact that it's there. The thing that gets in the way is whenever it is that we're so busy fighting about the thing that we don't get into the conversation beyond it. Do you remember she talked at some point, she said, when we try to talk openly and honestly about race, white fragility quickly emerges, as we so often are met with, silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, other forms of pushback. Things that make it so that we automatically go into a competitive mode rather than into a space of learning with each other. Because when we talk about those two things that she said before, objectivity and individualism, it's hard for us not to have a third thing that enters into that, and that's competitiveness. My objective space is better than your objective space, or my individual, the way I do individualism is better than yours. And so we easily get in that space of arguing for or against something. And all of that doesn't help. Is my generalization the best generalization or yours? It's not about that. Are you overdoing it or me? All of that gets in the way of us being in the conversation with each other. And it means that we, especially the ones who have come from the majority population and have a system that works easier for us, it's easy for us to get into the space of not wanting to be uncomfortable. And the conversation around race issues should make us uncomfortable. And if in whatever way we're stopping the conversation in order to make it easier for me, it's probably at the detriment of the conversation.
Jim?
Yes.
Even before get into a conversation, I find in the presence of someone of color that I am a little tippy-toe. In other words, I'm maybe more nice than I would be if it were only all white people there.
Mary, I don't think anyone would accuse you of being nice. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, even before I begin the conversation, I've already made some assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And my perceptions come from my position. If I might, you know, depending on how the person is dressed, is that someone who is a bus operator, and I might see myself as over that person. There are just way too many clues out there that tell me that I'm more superior, and I believe it. And it affects everything I do and every place I go and every person I meet. And I catch myself, and I don't know what to do about it other than to try to continue to engage.
Yeah. So, Evelyn, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, but let me make this point real quick. I think it goes back to her basic thing when she was talking about naming our race, right where she started at. She said a couple of different things. White people's opinions of racism tend to be strong. But secondly, she said, but race relations are profoundly complex.
Mm.
And so if we haven't done deep study, and she said, nothing in mainstream culture allows us to easily do that, allows us to easily have all the information to really back up and have those strong opinions that we tend to have. And so we're usually, she used these terms, our opinions are necessarily uninformed, even ignorant. Why? Because we hold them strongly, which means that we do not hear anything else but them, and they are uninformed because it's too complex for this to talk about the whole thing easily. And because of that, when we go into these situations with people and we're trying to relate to them, part of what we're doing is we're seeing them speak a larger picture than just this view that I have held on to so well and so long. And so they're saying, but I see a different thing. And we have to challenge ourselves to listen and hear the larger picture that they're telling us. Evelyn.
Yes, I want to go to the subject of the system and power part of the racism. You know, all too often here, everyone wants to legislate something to cover the problem. So as in general, most people, we vote for various officials, get them elected, you know, because they're on this particular path of civil rights or whatever it is that we like to see. And after they're elected, we feel, oh, great, we voted for this person, they made it, we're done, we did our part. And from there, nothing else gets done. We don't voice our concerns if we see them not doing things quite right. We're not actively interacting with them to stay the course. And we just like to pass a buck rather than work with the people around us, maybe our companies we work for, whatever that case may be. It just seems we want to pass the buck on to the legislatures.
That's right. And it's because almost by definition, if we go back to our definition of what racism is,
Mhm.
it is much larger than any of us.
Mhm.
Much more complicated than anybody but Jenny could solve.
Mhm.
She might be able to, right? And so there's a certain amount of trust we have to have in our legislators, but if we just trust them, they're going to easily be swept into the decisions that have been made in the past, especially because, what is it, 80–90% are male, the vast majority are white. It's going to be simple for it to continue to be the decisions it has been before, right? So we have to be very active in saying what else can happen.
I think if we walk into that when we're having those kinds of discussions, or if we're in a position to be talking to people in authority, that elected officials, is to remind them there are no simple answers to these complicated issues. And I think we all tend to go, can we just make it simple and make it stop?
Yeah.
Because it's hard work at any level, whether it's me and Evelyn talking over coffee about it or trying to go out and do that. Jim, you brought up something at the last class about whites turning around at some point, and I remember when this happened within my own peer group, and saying, how come I don't get grant money? How come I don't get affirmative action to go to school or whatever? And the people that I was hearing it from, I graduated from South Point in the late 70s. So pretty affluent group of kids and families. The one that spoke the loudest got a baseball scholarship, chose to leave college 2 years early to go pro. And then 20 years later, complained that he wasn't getting freebies when he didn't take advantage of the scholarship program he got 20 years prior. And I'm the only brown person in the room. How do I reply to that? You know?
Again and again in the conversation that Oprah had with leading Black leaders, they said, white America has got to take a leading role in this. If we are waiting for the one brown person in the conversation to talk about brown rights, or the one Black person in the room to stand up for, then it's not ever going to happen. Unless we choose to have the conversation, unless we choose to be honest with each other and struggle with each other, then it's not going to happen, right? That's too much to ask of a singular person within a large group. We've got to have more of a conversation than that.
Well, but there's another thing I'd like to say about that. I think it would be easier to have that conversation if we had a clarity of values.
Mm-hmm.
And if we bought into those values. And it disappoints me in a lot of ways that the church hasn't been leading us to question those values. Now, the present president, I think, has helped us focus that some, but we have to go further.
Yeah.
And I think that's what will help us penetrate those hard times and say, this is the anchor. This is the place where we want to be. And this is what we want to get done.
Yeah. That all of that, go ahead. I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
End of sermon.
No. And all of this is a deeply religious question, right? It is essentially the question that has been asked throughout the ages of humankind to try to figure out, how do we step towards the best possible person that we can be, the best possible community we can be. It is the building of the kingdom of God question that Jesus talked about all the time. How do we bring that heaven down to this space on earth? And it's hard because who we are here doesn't translate well into the largest picture of what God
I just want your picture out here for a minute.
Okay. So at the end of the first chapter, she did ask some questions though that I think would help us in that type of thing. Did you see those questions right at the end? Just basic questions. Why does this unsettle me?
Okay.
Why? What would it mean if this thing, whatever it is, what would it mean if this is true? How does this lens change my understanding of racial dynamics? How can my unease help reveal the unexamined assumptions I have been making? And is it possible that because I am white, there are some racial dynamics that I can't see? All of those questions that she asked, and that's right at the end of the first chapter, we should go back to periodically and just ask that and say, how is it that this is, that I can look at this differently? Hi, Kay.
Hi.
Introduce.
I just wanted the people to know who my new roommate was. Some of you know already, but I don't think Richard was in the picture last week, was he?
No, he was not.
I brought Richard in to meet Jim. Richard is an asylum seeker from Uganda who is currently living with me now. Today is 3 weeks.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you doing?
Great. How are you?
I am very well, thank you.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Nice to
But
meet
I just needed
It's nice to meet you.
I
Hi,
needed to
Richard.
show
Good to
my
see you
steps
again.
towards.
All right, thank you.
Good luck.
All right.
Thank you.
So the question is, and Richard's a good example, I'm sure that if you go to him and you ask him some questions about what America looks like, he'll tell you completely different than any of us had ever heard before, because he's coming from a very different space than any of us. But he would also speak very differently than our African American brothers and sisters, right? Because he comes from a different space than that. And so just to, it really takes me being willing to move towards him and say, speak your perspective to me. And not just have that person speak, but be able to listen when they tell us some of the harsh things that are there.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the difficult things that they've had to face. Some of the realities that we are easily blinded from. Where is it that you're able to have that type of conversation with someone? How have you placed yourself in that space?
Yeah, that's a better question.
Are you asking Richard?
Anybody?
No, he's
Anybody?
Oh, okay. Let you off the hook, Richard. You know, what comes to me very clearly as a memory was the point at which I would find myself wanting to cross the street if there was a person of color coming my direction. And I don't know where it came from, but why would I have such I had to admit that I was terribly uncomfortable and uneasy. And I would guess that it's because of the stories mainly I'd heard from my classmates. And my parents had never told me to go to the other side of the street if there was a colored person on the street. So where did those come from? And they were real. And I don't know that there isn't a case in certain parts of the country where I would feel that way no matter what. Because there are certain parts of the country I have a prejudice about.
Yeah. And I think acknowledging that that's true is showing that you are carrying whatever bias, whatever prejudice was built into you. But now the question is, what do you do with that today? And how do you face it in this moment, right? How does it affect you both in good ways and in not so good ways, right? Leticia.
Mary, that might not even be what I would consider a prejudice. I got mugged, physically mugged, 2 years ago by two very big black men. I see two very big black men come by me, and subconsciously I go the other way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't consider that that's a fear movement,
Yeah.
right? I'm acting on my fear.
Sure.
That I have to be very conscious of, but that's self-work that I need to do. And a lot of this is self-work.
Sure, but it's more than that, Leticia, too. I don't want to diminish what you said. That's important. That there are things, there are reasons why there are truths behind that. But we've also told a lot of institutional messages about black crime, for example, that allows, because these two black men attacked me, then I need to be fearful of all black men, right? And so it's much easier for us to be in a space of fear because of some of the systems that are there that have taught us since we were young certain stories. Does that make sense? So I don't want to diminish what you said, because it's a true thing that's fear. But it's what we have to do is look at the larger picture too.
And I can appreciate that, but I also, as a person of color, I listen to those conversations, and sometimes I hear more guilt and confused guilt from people
Shame
who
even.
are honestly trying to be conscious, and they have for a long time. And a lot of you folks are a good 20 years older than I am, 10 to 20 years older than I am. So you live.
She's 70, by the way.
Huh?
I'm just kidding you.
Oh, me? No.
You are.
I think I'm the baby in the room right now. But you lived in a very conscious generation. By the late 70s, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, in the 80s, we were getting a little bit more materialistic, and we weren't as socially conscious. But our kids have come out pretty good.
Well, I think there's another element too. As a young child, I was taught that if there was a person of color, particularly a black person, coming down the sidewalk and our paths were going to cross, it was their responsibility to cross the street, not mine, theirs. But if they didn't, they were trained too. They were trained by white people to do that. But if they didn't, then I needed to cross the street.
Did you live in the
That's
South?
out in the community too. What? What?
Did you live in the South?
I was, technically it's not the South, but I was taught to be prejudiced, to not, all that stuff. I went to a segregated school and I didn't even know it until I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
So where?
Figure it out.
Yeah.
West Virginia.
Yeah.
My whole family.
Oh, yeah.
I was taught.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that whole thing about going to a segregated school and nobody and you didn't know it.
Not knowing it.
That's very typical.
Yeah.
We have things that are there that are unexamined.
Right.
And at least part of what we have to start doing is thinking and examining. Not because every system around us is wrong, but because we have to identify where it is that there are wrong implications of that system. And if we just take it without examining it, we perpetuate systems that we don't want to perpetuate.
Right.
Go ahead.
I'm remembering when we lived in the Washington, D.C. area in the early 50s, when a lot of this stuff was going on. And Washington, D.C. proper had decided to allow people of color to go into restaurants. The conversation among white people was mainly fear. My parents didn't seem to be feared, maybe because my dad worked in the city and he was, you know, he was socialized with a lot more people. But a lot of people that we spoke with were terrified that what was going to happen was that everyone of color was going to take over all the restaurants in Washington, D.C., as if that were possible. It took quite a while for people to adjust to the fact that that there was a normal state that was going to occur, and in fact, they need not fear that the restaurant would be overtaken. It was fear, just out and out, the fear of not knowing anybody else. Because Peggy just mentioned going to school, not realizing that it was a segregated school, and she had no experience with anyone other than her white friends and family and members of her family and their friends. Much like I did, although my schools have a little more integrated than that, but
yeah,
pretty much.
The challenge today, Mary, is slightly different, because back in the 1950s, probably and I'm just making these figures up, probably the white to non-white ratio was somewhere around 80 to 80, 20, 85, 15, something like that, right? That the total population of people of color was very small. Now it's close to 50-50. And so if you go into any restaurant, if you could go into any restaurant, the chances are you're going to have somebody of color there, right? That's the reality.
Depends on where you live.
It does depend on where you live.
Yeah, it does depend on where you live. This is a different object, and Washington, D.C. is heavily colored and always has been.
Sure.
So,
but I would still venture to say that you're not going to go into many restaurants these days without a person of color there. Okay?
Yeah.
And so in some ways, we look at that and we're able to excuse ourselves, well, we're not like that. Right? We're no longer that American over there. But that would make it so that we're not dealing with the fact of, are most of the people of color the ones behind the counter? Or the ones sitting at the table? Right. Is there, you know what I'm saying? Is there an economic differential that could be looked at in that? Go ahead.
Jim, do you know the percentages for Pima County's diversity? Thereabouts?
I can find that for us.
No, I know most of it.
Okay.
All of Pima County, the black population is 3.3%. Okay. The white population is 42.8%. The Hispanic population is 39.7%. And we haven't included any Asians, Tongans, or other minorities. Guess who's in Pima County, the minority?
Yeah. Yeah.
You add up those numbers, folks.
Yeah. And that's the new reality. And we have to say, what are the messages that are still out there that we're not looking at? That's what this chapter, these chapters were about, is where is it that we are still not having the conversations we should have? How is it that people are overlooked or pushed away? And you can have that conversation in a lot of different ways. Go and talk to Stuart Chan, for example, right? Chinese descent, right? But has been here probably longer than most of you. His family has been in the Tucson area probably longer than most of you. And talk to him about what his family has faced or not faced in that 100 years or so that they've been a part of the Tucson community. Right? That's a pretty simple conversation to have. But it's a good conversation. Now, don't everybody go at once, because then he'll know that there's somebody set him on, you know. But do try to have that type of conversation and think about other people who you might have that type of conversation with. What has it been like being, what is it like for you in our space here? And how much does that match up to, how much does their experience match up to your experience?
Well, Mike and I had.
One of the things that is, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
What's really,
let's go talk about.
what's really interesting, what's
Mike,
interesting to me is right now, I can't have a conversation with anybody but my wife. I'm locked in the house and it's hard to have conversations with anybody. And so we are living in that kind of a situation and probably will for quite a while.
Yeah.
But what is important is I begin to be more conscious of what's gone on in my past and what's going on in my present. And whenever I do have a conversation, maybe I'll be a little more prepared.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's easy to say, well, I just got to have conversations with somebody. That's really hard right now. And whether I'm going to have a conversation about racism or politics or religion or healthcare, one of those is going to come up. So how do I be conscious of all of them? I know we're focused on racism right now, and we can use the same practices in the other situations as well. But as we come to the end of the group, what I want to be able to do is be more conscious of what's going on.
Part of the conversations that you can have easily right now, Mike, are the kind of conversations we're having, not necessarily with each other, but conversations with books. Read some of the books, like Ibram Kendi's book, right? And hear from his perspective what it is that his particular Black experience in America has been, right? He's going to have just as many biases and prejudices as anybody else is. He's a human being in this world. But you'll be able to hear a perspective that isn't going to be the normal one you listen to. And so right now, maybe those are the kinds of conversations you can easily have, is to read lots right now. And not in a way that makes it so you start off by fighting against it, but so that you're open to letting it sweep into you.
And thing I would want us to remember is D'Angelo's point that what we really need to be looking at here is not individual prejudice,
That's right.
but the system of racism that we have that underlies everything else.
Yeah. And the very real challenge of trying to figure out how to change that system.
Yep.
Because it is so pervasive and so unquestioned in very many ways. And this is for one of the very first times really challenging us to question that. Evelyn.
Yeah, I come down to Tucson when I can, and I get with Letitia and we do many things. But when we go running around town together, especially the last couple months, she makes it a point to start bringing up these questions with various people, especially people of color, whether they're Hispanic or Black, discussing these race issues. And the sometimes it's about their culture and for them to empower themselves to climb up above this mess, because it is within their power as well to not say I am oppressed or whatever. I do have these opportunities that I can apply and drive myself forward. Just let me do it. Remove some of that interference.
Yeah. And that's and trying to figure out how to remove that interference, how to work against some of the laws that are in place that make it simpler for this or that to happen. Here's one of the biggest things that happens is when we put in a program like affirmative action, you get a whole bunch of pushback, and partially because it has both good and bad implications to it, but also partially because it pushes against the system we have.
I
Right.
have an issue with affirmative action on one side. I do, it has its benefit. There's a lot of people that have been given opportunities and have shined with it, rightfully so. My only issue, working with it back in the 80s when it came in aerospace industry, there was a big push for them just to meet the quota. So they were putting various people in positions that weren't qualified. Now that doesn't negate the ones that really were qualified and got the opportunity they finally deserved, but where the companies really did the people a disservice, and even the rest of the employees, they did not provide the training or educational needs for that person to truly succeed in that position.
Yeah.
They dropped the ball. We made our quota. Yeah, they're here in this management position, but they left them to flounder, you know.
Sure. And that could have been for a number of different reasons. If there was underlying prejudice in that manager who didn't want the person to succeed, they might have not put forth the effort to do that training as they would have with a different candidate of a different race. Who knows? I mean, it's all those things that we have got to face and honestly deal with. The bad news is it won't be solved tomorrow. The good news is there's a prime opportunity to begin to have some of the conversations to make it so that there is a better solution. Thank you for being part of that conversation. I'm glad we have a smaller group here. This was much more conversational today, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here and for making that happen. The recording will be available to you if you want to go back and check any of the things that were said and, you know, and fix all the things that are wrong. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
How much are we reading this week?
A couple of different chapters. Go to the end of chapter 3, if you will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Already done that.
Oops. Okay.